or rather page 15 from the paragraph beginning with our real challenge.
Our real challenge is the problem of the corruption of knowledge. This has come about due to our own state of confusion, as well as influences coming from philosophy, science, and ideology of modern Western culture and civilization. Intellectual confusion emerges as a result of changes and restriction in the meaning of key terms that project the worldview derived from revelation. The repercussions arising from this intellectual confusion manifest themselves in moral and cultural dislocation, which is symptomatic of the degeneration of religious knowledge, faith, and values. The changes and restrictions in the meanings of such key terms occur due to the spread of secularization as a philosophical program, which holds sway over the hearts and minds and meshed in the crisis of truth and the crisis of identity. These crises, in turn, have become actualized as a result of secularized system of education that causes deviations, because severance from historical roots that have been firmly established by our wise and illustrious predecessors upon foundations vitalized by religion. One must see that the kind of problem confronting us in such a profound nature has to embrace all the fundamental elements of our worldview that cannot simply be resolved by legalistic and political means. Law and order can only find their places in recognition of truth as distinguished from falsehood, and real as distinguished from illusionary is affirmed and confirmed by action in acknowledgement of the recognition. This is achieved by means of right knowledge and right method of disseminating it. So let us not dissipate our energies in attempting to find a way out of groping in a labyrinth of legalism, but concentrate them instead by grappling the main problem, which is bound up intimately with the correct understanding and appreciation of religion and the worldview projected by it. Because that directly concerns man, his knowledge and purpose in life, his ultimate destiny. The process of accusation of knowledge is not called education unless the knowledge is that is acquired includes moral purpose that activates in the one who acquires it what I call adab. Adab is right action that springs from self-discipline, founded upon knowledge, whose source is wisdom. For the sake of convenience, I should translate adab simply as right action. There is an intrinsic connection between meaning and knowledge. I define meaning as the recognition of the place of anything in a system, which occurs when the relation a thing has with others in the system becomes clarified and understood. Place refers to right or proper place in the system. And system here refers to the Quranic conceptual system as formulated into a worldview by tradition and articulated by religion. Knowledge, as we have already defined is the arrival of meaning in the soul and the soul's arrival of meaning. And this is the recognition of the proper places of things in the order of creation, such that it leads to the recognition of the proper place of God in the order of being in existence. But knowledge as such does not become an education unless recognition of the proper places is actualized by acknowledgement, that is, by confirmation and affirmation in the self of the reality and truth of what is recognized. Acknowledgement necessitates action that is proper to recognition, and that the right action consists of such acknowledgement. Education, then, is the absorption of adab in the self. The actualization of adab in individual selves, composing society as a collective entity, reflects the condition of justice, and justice itself is a reflection of wisdom, which is a light that is lit from the lamp of prophecy that enables the recipient to discover the right and proper place for thing or being to be. The condition of being in the proper place is what I've called justice, and adab is that cognitive action by which we actualize the condition of being in the proper place. So adab, in the sense I'm defining here, is also a reflection of wisdom, and with respect to society, adab is just order within it. Adab, concisely defined, is the spectacle of justice, adab, and reflected as it is reflected by wisdom.
Okay. So, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursalin. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. We continue reading the work of the alim, Professor Sayyid Muhammad Naqib bin Ali bin Abdullah bin Muhsin al-Attas, which is titled Prolegomena to the Metaphysics of Islam, and we get now to the crux of the problem affecting the world more generally, and the Muslim civilization particularly. And that is the problem of the corruption of knowledge. Now, this term, the corruption of knowledge, can only be properly appreciated, understood, after having understood the real meaning of knowledge, yani al-ilm. And as we know, the insight as to the fact that knowledge is not neutral is something that Professor Naqib Al-Attas has already written about, discussed, lectured, and delivered to various crowds ever since the 70s at the very least. Because we know that in his aims and objectives of Islamic education, in which he's an editor and he contributed the opening remarks, as well as an article containing what would become the de-westernization of knowledge as a chapter. Professor Attas has already pointed out the fact that knowledge is not neutral. In other words, that knowledge takes on the color of the civilization responsible for construction of that knowledge. There are basically assumptions, what we call base assumptions or ground assumptions that are no longer challenged, that becomes the building blocks of a knowledge system. Now, these things derive from the philosophical conclusions of a particular civilization or the religious conclusions, depending on such civilizations. And this is the basis of what was said last week by John Locke, who discovered, according to him, that that knowledge is cultural. Yes, in other words, that different cultural systems produces different worldviews, and to this, Locke derived a further conclusion that therefore the mind is a tabula rasa, able to accept any conclusion depending on the culture, while it may resist certain things like internal contradictions and so on. But here, our answer to that is that the mind is not a tabula rasa, but rather the mind is in fact influenced by the cultural and the social structures and the philosophical assumptions of the culture that a particular person or a mind is raised in. However, that the mind is created with an internal capacity to arrive at reality and truth. Yes, and the ability to arrive at reality and truth is also partially because of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or rather ultimately because of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we speak therefore about the problem of the corruption of knowledge, Prophet Attas said that it is due to our own state of confusion, and then from influences coming from the philosophy, science, and ideology of modern Western culture and civilization. The method of its dissemination is relatively known if we study the books of history. It is mainly due to external occupation and education, because as we know, as late as the 19th century, almost all the Muslim nations would have now received political imperialism from the Western nations. And one of the things that has been done included what is called epistemicide, yes, the killing of indigenous forms of knowing. And this policy of epistemicide, or what we call the murder and the genocide of not just indigenous sources of knowing, but likewise the institutions that supported such forms of knowing or such epistemologies, is well documented in various works. As we know, at least Taha Abdul Rahman, who have now been studied by Wa'il Hallaq, in the introduction, Professor Wa'il Hallaq mentions the structural genocide effected by the French against the northern African states. And when we say structural genocide, it means the destruction of the awqaf that is so crucial to fund the education programs. And then, of course, gradually at the same time, through the separating of the community from their scholars, the separation of the ruling class from the scholars, and then eventually through the introduction of Western modes of knowing. And Prof. Atas has summarized this in the Muslim Dilemma in 2 steps. Basically, is the severance of the connection between the Muslims and their source of knowledge, and then secondly, the introduction of Western modes of knowing. So that's the source of corruption of knowledge. And when we say severance, certainly there are variations and elaborations on how the severance took place. One of which may include the introduction of Western concepts. Either the introduction of Western concepts is mediated through a particular language, i.e. just the introduction of concepts by education system, or it may include the promotion of a Western language to replace the indigenous language, or thirdly, it may come through the substituting of the writing system, yes, the Romanization of the scripts. These are all various modes, yes, to induce within local consciousness the Western modes of thinking. And of course, if they also introduce Western universities, then you would have an alternative, well-developed, elaborated curriculum, as well as a methodology that defends the integrity of the Western modes of thinking. So you will see, therefore, that at the higher levels, linguistics, social linguistics, and various branches of linguistics are introduced, including methods of exegesis, including what they call the method of hermeneutics. All the methods that they have developed to study their own tradition is brought to bear upon local traditions, and the selection of literature to be taught. All of these things, yes, these are these constitute nothing less than a social engineering program. And of course, you would then have conscious and unconscious disseminators. Moreover, when we look at the internal causes, yes, that led the Muslims to take on Western modes of thinking, we see also this in the fact that there are 2 components of Western science or Western learning. One is the theoretical components. As the theoretical components, yes, when we speak about theory and methodology, revolves around the study of philosophy, as it says here, philosophy, science, ideology. These are all what we call the theoretical components, and the concepts. Yes, a person may study law, economics, political science, and get used to the Western notions such as justice, power, liberty. All these are direct means of adopting Western ideas. Another means is the a rather more elaborate means. It comes first through the modernization of the Muslim nations, as has been clearly documented. For example, in the case of Ottoman Turkey, the Caliph introduced measures such as the Tanzimat, as the modernization effects, having recognized technological superiority in the West. That they saw, for example, that the state of their technology could no longer rival, say, what was developing in Britain, what was developing in the other foes amongst the Europeans. So what then do they do? We know that by the time of the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, as has been documented by the likes of Ahmad Dalal, say, in Islam Without Europe. In that work, he mentions, and as well as Khalid al-Ruwayhib. So they mention this period of time as the evolution of Islamic thought to the point of discursive, deep reading. Yes, this was the time of great synthesis between the disciplines. This was the time that metaphysics have reached a very mature stage. Likewise, tafsir has reached a very mature stage. This was also the time that they started producing encyclopedia cross-referencing between the disciplines. And then they produced, likewise, great scholars such as Al-Bajuri, yes, Taftazani, Al-Iji, amongst the later ones, in other words, involving themselves in multidisciplinary efforts in their hashiyat. Yes, so basically they are writing now not just commentaries, but super commentaries and glosses upon the great works. And so this was a time of great intellectual depth in the Muslim nations. But we know that the intellectual depth need not necessarily translate into technological advancement. Yes, because knowledge is knowledge and technology is technology. As we know, technology, joined between two words, technique and logos, involves merely the utilization of a means to effectively reach a desired end. So now, what the West has done ever since the Francis Bacon's time, to focus on knowledge that leads to further dominion in nature, is to focus on the development of technique. But we know also that that which would gradually lead to the Industrial Revolution and the craze to develop technology was also at the same time became possible because of imperialism and colonialism. And these two basically, let us say, corrupt ideological practice, or rather corrupt practices, rest on a corrupt ideology. And what is that? Well, the ideology of racism, the ideology of the homo sacer, meaning to say the belief that some human beings are not properly human beings, so therefore deserving of being conquered, deserving of being, let us say, shipped from one place to another place as slaves. And that is what made possible the great transference of gold, say, from South America to parts of Europe, funding, yes, the Industrial Revolution, because the development of technology, the development of knowledge at that pace would require a lot of resources. And so what supported, yes, so you see what supported this great facade is are these corrupt ideologies, yes, including, of course, the belief that the corruption involves, say, first the oppression or injustice towards fellow mankind, and then the corruption and injustice towards nature likewise. And so that's why we see the effects of such corrupt ideologies is still felt until today. Yes, including, of course, the corrupt ideologies of capitalism and the other phase, communism, and the development of technique to such levels until it became an oppressive, let us say, tool. Yes, so technology became developed to such an extent. In the Risalah untuk kaum Muslimin, the Malay text Professor Atas dictated, he mentions an analogy like of the household knife. You see, in the hands of a loving housewife, the household knife is not does not pose as a dangerous object. Yes, it's useful for cutting, for preparing dinner and so on. But the very same knife, let us say there was a burglary and a robber were to enter upon the house. So this burglar then comes into possession of this knife. The very same knife could be a murder weapon. Yes, and then it could be exhibited as a murder weapon after that. What has happened to the knife? Did the knife have, did it undergo a transformation? It is still the same. So therefore, it is the worldview in that sense. It is the worldview of the user that would use this particular tool to fulfill their desires. Now, the same case happened with technique and technology. Yes, so let us say that technology in the West, including the very understanding of religion for them, one particular understanding that has been dominant in history is the technological understanding. Freud wrote about this, Spinoza wrote about this. The technological understanding of religion is the belief that mankind invented religion and the gods in order for a means of psychic well-being, basically to to appease oneself against the against the forces of nature, against the risks involved in agriculture, and certainly because of the psychological weakness of man. So therefore they invented a higher being like that. And of course, some of them went to develop this garbage further, like Freud in a particular work called Moses and Monotheism, in which he tries to trace the origins of monotheism to the historical Moses, who was killed by his own people, and out of their guilt they projected the figure of God as of course not even historians, not even Western historians took him seriously, yes, be it amongst the Christians nor the Jews. Yes, and it is unfortunate because he had, at least in psychology, some creative ideas or interesting ideas nonetheless. So now this corruption of knowledge, can you imagine? Yes, the first, the overdevelopment of technique and the technological aspect of knowledge to serve the corrupt ideologies. Yes, or rather the ideologies have now become to such an extent that remove of religious content, these ideologies become means to further power, either at the individual level, the racial level, or some form of collective unit. Yes, perhaps class, the means of the bourgeoisie, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, that's what happens to knowledge once it's corrupted. You see, because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran that وَلَئِنِ اتَّبَعْتَ أَهْوَاءَهُمْ بَعْدَ الَّذِي جَاءَكَ مِنَ الْعِلْمِ. Yes, if you were to follow their desires after knowledge has come to you. Yes, in other words, ilm as ilm would contain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's command. Ilm as ilm would not be something that is value neutral. Ilm as ilm would contain ethical and spiritual limits and commands and prohibitions. But imagine now, having removed of the religious content, what remains of knowledge? Knowledge remains as technique and technology, and as a means to advance the desires of man. So it becomes now, if knowledge is merely power and dominion, it becomes the futile exercise of the development of the whims and wishes of the few. And imagine, the level of corruption of knowledge here, yes, to such an extent that, scientists now have a hand in developing, weapons of mass destruction. And there were scientists who were, whose names were associated with, let us say, corrupt and oppressive regimes and corrupt and oppressive individuals. There was the likes of Martin Heidegger, who, in spite of his brilliance in ontology and in spite of his brilliance in some other disciplines of knowledge, was forever tainted because of his involvement with the Nazi regime. Yes, and likewise, many other, what we call the dark luminaries, yes, if such names, such an oxymoron can be applied to them, that their exercise in philosophical thought may involve trying to liberate a portion of society from oppressive systems of power. But what they try to liberate the society or the cross-section of society that they are appealing towards is basically just another power fighting against power. Yes, in truth, what has happened with the corruption of knowledge is that it leads to man worshipping his nafs. Yes, yes, have you not seen a person who has now taken his own hawa, his own desires as his Lord? So therefore, what's happened now is that, you will see different parts of society, different cross-sections of society. It became a crisis of identity. And this was something that perhaps even the likes of Fukuyama did not foresee, but now have seen, yes, in the problem of identity as the meltdown crisis now in political philosophy or in political science, because now identity becomes a means to let us say to further one's desires, whereas previously it was an identity per se. It was the class struggle. It was ideological struggle, say, between Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism against, say, the libertarians and the capitalists. But now, even within capitalist systems, let us say that the system of liberal capitalism is the one that is most conducive for individuals who wish to develop their own worship of their nafs. Yes, but then even within the liberal capitalist order, there are differences in power, differences in influence, and this is this, let us say, nightmarish situation have had their fair share of thought and contemplation since the times of Plato. You know that that in the Republic, Plato voiced, Plato has the figures Socrates as well as Thrasymachus. Meaning to say, Thrasymachus being let us say, the sophist. Yes, but we know that Plato himself, perhaps, yes, while we know that he was a student of Socrates and Socrates was his main mouthpiece, sometimes the arguments given to Thrasymachus are so good that perhaps it's very difficult to sometimes to think that perhaps even Plato might have entertained these ideas. The example, yes, Thrasymachus was in contrast to Socrates. Socrates believed that, say, virtue can be learned and virtue can be taught. Since virtue can be learned and virtue can also be taught, therefore, it is better to suffer injustice than to commit injustice, if it can be known. Meaning to say, if the epistemology is sound, it is better to suffer injustice than to commit. And furthermore, the just ruler would be happier than the unjust tyrant, because the just ruler would be perfecting something. As for the tyrant, he is living ever in fear, yes, because his main interest is just power, but he has to defend his power using propaganda, like that. But in one of the dialogues, if it wasn't Thrasymachus, then perhaps it was the cousins of Plato, Glaucon and Adeimantus, who said that this whole story about defending justice is a lie. We all know, yes, we all know that justice really is basically whatever the powerful decides. Yes, justice is really whatever the powerful decides. Secondly, the argument goes is that if there is any reason that society, that individuals within society chooses a life of justice, then it is because the individuals within that, then it is because justice brings about honor and injustice brings about disgrace. So meaning to say, the soft power of society is the one that forces individuals to be just, such that if a person was to be maligned, or rather that if you were framed and accused of being evil, even though you're not, then it is better to actually be evil, isn't it? Or the other way around. Yes, and this is the position of the state of corrupt knowledge. So corrupted knowledge, it is a scary reality that we live in today. We know the movies that are dystopian in nature, and earlier on it was the novels, the like of Brave New World, 1984, the Batman trilogy. Yes, these basically these artifacts of the mind, they point to the reality of the corruption of knowledge. They point to the reality when supposing there is no knowledge of good and evil. Yes, then what happens in society? That's what holds the fabric of society together. And it's interesting, when Christopher Nolan directed the second one, is it Batman? It's not Begins. The second one is The Dark Knight. Yes. So in the Dark Knight, you see the exploration of several of these characters. Yes. So basically, there are several strategies that you can take in a world where ethical knowledge is defined. Yes. And then in the third installment, he explores it further. Yes, through Bane and the revolt of the masses. Nevertheless, the basic idea of the corruption of knowledge is the reduction of knowledge to technique. And when knowledge is reduced to technique, we see it that we might think that the dystopian examples of Gotham City, of Brave New World in 1984 is terrible, but the reality that we live in today is not far off from that, and in some cases it's worse off than that, isn't it? We know that people who have power will not have scruples to use it, and we know that there is a steady move, yes, a steady move to the development of technology of control. In fact, yes, John Stuart Mill, as we discussed, he was raised in the household of James Mill under the tutelage of Jeremy Bentham. So Bentham had this idea of something called the panopticon. Yes, he designed, using what was available in the imagination of the 19th century, a sort of prison that this prison would have its inmates always conscious that they are being watched. And so there is so the idea of a panopticon is that there could be like a voyeur sitting there. You do not know if there's let's say the warden is watching you or not, but he could be. Yes. And so this is the birth of the prison system. Yes, that whose technology is now much more advanced, leading to to its users beyond the confines, yes, of the prisons, isn't it? Whereas previously, as we know, in the European nations, their preferred method of punishment was the Goric, let us say, dismemberment, killing in the general public to create fear. They have, after the adjustments and the recommendations of political philosophers, the likes of Jeremy Bentham and beyond, improved it so as to have to create, the notion of surveillance. And now we see the technology developing to that regard. The restriction of key terms, yes. Subhanallah. And then why are we at such a disadvantaged position today as Muslims? Is because as Muslims ourselves, we have no ilm anymore, isn't it? As we know, the problem of the restriction of the meaning of key terms has had its manifestation earlier on in the civilization, as has been observed by the likes of Imam Al-Ghazali. Imam Al-Ghazali in the Kitab Al-Ilm noticed that if that's due to the sheer development of the individual disciplines, the likes of fiqh and other disciplines made it possible that an individual person may study and develop himself within a discipline of knowledge such that the knowledge does not serve the adab. Yes. In other words, you may study a discipline of knowledge, let us say fiqh, to the exclusion of tasawwuf and tawheed, such that you can be a munafiq in that sense, or you can be a fasiq. That you use your knowledge for the sake of your employment, for the sake of fame, and the other things that impacts the soul. Whereas we know in the Quran, yes, and in the Hadith, yes, the plural ulum did not exist. Yes. Do you see any examples of ulum? Can you give examples of ulum in the Hadith and the Quran? And certainly the word fiqh does not refer to law, yes, or just law. So, and in the occurrences in the Hadith and the Quran, the word tafaqqaha means all of the essential knowledge. Yes. In fact, if we are to find an equivalent, say, it would be something like the word gnosis. In other words, knowledge produces a sort of consciousness, because knowledge cannot be separated from khashya. Yes, as we know, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء. But in the examples of corrupted knowledge, we have seen just now that precisely men of knowledge, yes, women of knowledge, have been the cause of the greatest corruption on earth today. Yes, it is men and women of knowledge who have now tinkered, let us say, the banking system, who have tinkered with the financial system, and introduce terminologies that obfuscates the many, but allows for a party to oppress another party. It is the men and women of knowledge, yes, who uses, say, legal means, yes, or rather the sophistication of legal terms to set free criminals and to put behind bars those who are innocent. It is the men and women of knowledge who serve the state and other powerful conglomerates to the detriment of the masses. Yes, what is called the ratchet. Yes, so therefore, this is truly a corruption of knowledge. Yes, it is the men and women of knowledge now who, through the means of writing contracts and the means of writing other forms of works, find loopholes for people in order to be free from, let us say, persecution and so on and so forth, so that and to create, let us say, safe havens such that they can oppress with impunity and so on and so forth. So you see, therefore, that the problem of the corruption of knowledge here is that it cannot be solved simply by legalistic and political means. Yes, law and order can only find their places when recognition of truth as distinguished from falsehood and real as distinguished from illusory is affirmed and confirmed by action in acknowledgement of the recognition. Yes, so these are the two chief means, isn't it, that other people concentrate upon trying to change. Yes, they say, if only we change the law. But we see that, or if only we change governments, surely we would solve our problem. But if the problem of corruption of knowledge is so widespread, then you would derive from the same pool of people, or rather a different face, but the same characteristics and reality. So, Wallahu A'lam, I think that is the extent that we wish to share today. Let us hear our round of reflections, and if you have any questions.
No, I found the last part you said very interesting. So I think that what you're trying to hint at is that the corruption of knowledge is based on what we talked about the last time about the metaphysical. You move away from metaphysics and you make ethics into the domain of the modern sciences, like psychology.
Yes.
And what we're doing that's I know there's one missing link between them. I was trying to write it down, but by doing that, you basically introduce the corruption of knowledge. Well, my question then becomes, so, I mean, for us looking back on it retrospectively, it's very obvious that these changes happen. But at the same time, if you were somebody who grew up in that area, at one point you're sort of affected by society that you might not notice these things going on. But to what extent can we say that the thinkers that we have talked about thus far, to what extent were they simply victims of history just playing out? And to what extent were they actively keeping up, creating history?
Yeah, well, that's a very complex question that would require several theses to answer. But some parts of the answer to that questions have been written. First, whether they were they products of their time, or did they actively try to change their time? At the very least, there is a period of 50 years in which there was a concerted effort. That is the Enlightenment period, in which there was a concerted effort amongst some figures who were, who called themselves philosophers, who were actively trying to develop an alternative society built on the notion of progress that would be liberating society from what they perceive to be the corruption of religion. So, interestingly, what we can say about the problem of secularization is that, in truth, secularization should have been, yes, should have been a local issue, as it was a European situation in truth. But because of the unfortunate case of colonization and imperialism and the vast development of technique and technology, they were able to globalize their internal predicament. And also, of course, coupled with their own hubris and their belief in what they call to be, what is called by Prophet Tas to be, their belief as, this was internal to them, but, their belief in evolution led them to believe that they are the most developed of the human races, and all other cultures are lagging behind. And it is the white man's burden, to assist and to liberate the other people so as to be at their level or approaching their level. As for the individuals who actively tried to limit and then to restrict the key terms and to basically to lay the foundation from scratch for society, these are the encyclopedists initially, the likes of D'Alembert and Denis Diderot, Voltaire. So they were philosophical popularizers. So they wrote novels and treatises. They wrote likewise in this encyclopedia and several tracts that they have written. Their interest is to influence the general population that you can have an alternative worldview which is different from that of the Christian worldview. Charles Taylor, the historian of secularization, wrote in his big tome, 1,000-page Secular Age, a grand thesis wherein his contention was that, say, somewhere around 1650 or earlier, it was almost unthinkable, yes, that anyone within the society could inhabit a worldview other than a theistic worldview, until you get to the point where now, even amongst the strongest, yes, the strongest theists, they now would have to accept a pluralistic society. Yes, of course. I think Peter Berger wrote, a brief critique of Charles Taylor, saying that, well, that doesn't justify the age being a secular age. That merely says that we are living in a plural age. Nonetheless, the idea of a secular age is that secularity is the public domain now, but one of the contentions of Charles Taylor was that there is something like a supernova effect when some of the factors they arrange and coalesce together within themselves. Eventually, the process of secularization went so rapid that it became virtually impossible for people to return to the earlier period. And this corresponds also partially with the French Revolution, which is the front, and the sexual revolution. First, corresponding with the French Revolution, and we know the sexual revolution would lead to loss of inhibition, isn't it? If you sexual revolution would lead to the destruction of marriages, and the destruction of marriages leads to the destruction of families and stable units of moral and ethical development. And you can imagine children being raised in such households, if they grow to have some, say, mature minds, if ever, then such minds would be unlikely to support systems of structure and would want to promote even more and even a more extreme case of liberty. Now we are at the very tail end of it. So we know that Western historians have been speaking about the decline of Western civilization since the late 19th century. Oswald Spengler wrote his great work, the Decline of the West, in the early 20th century, and corresponding with the World War. The very fact of the possibility of a world war, yes, is the outcome of corruption of knowledge. So you can imagine, the distressful situation that the likes of the historians and the Thomists amongst the Christians tried to remedy. So the likes of Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, and the historian Christopher Dawson, these three Christian scholars of the mid 20th century were trying to revive Thomism as a basis of metaphysics, because they thought that was the only, perhaps, a juncture at some point in their history that you can still preserve an ethics squarely upon a metaphysics. But the rest of the more dominant movement was the movement towards desecularization, until in Maritain's work, the peasant of the Garonne, where he criticizes the Catholic Church, he mentions that in parts of the work that the Second Vatican Council and several of these major events of Catholic history in the 20th century point to the fact that the secularization crisis has reached deep, yes, within the very councils, or within the ideas have affected even those within the council, such that they are unable to fend off the idea of corruption of knowledge. And only very recently we still saw perhaps in a long time, the first resignation of a pope, the Benedict, yes, who attributed it to the dictatorship of relativism. In other words, the notion of dictatorship of relativism is basically an extension of the corruption of knowledge. That that since there is no truth, since every individual subject wishes to extend for himself, a vision of society that she or he wants to live in, so therefore there is no absolute, in the sense of religious absolutes, that can truly govern mankind.
If I can add on to my question, Sheikh. You mentioned that the Enlightenment period is when they tried the hardest to create a new framework. During that time period, you also have the counter-Enlightenment thinkers like Burke, someplace in there, and some other thinkers. What do you think their role was? Do you think they tried, but they weren't successful?
Well, of course, you had the Romantics, and even perhaps some Christian thinkers. You had the anti-Enlightenment thinkers, but these thinkers, their contention against Enlightenment philosophy did not come from a position that could reverse the program. If you look at the likes of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's said to have been, the opposite position of the Enlightenment philosophers, he himself was a secularist. He built his system on a secular basis. In other words, they cannot really escape themselves. So this dichotomy that they introduce for themselves, the Romantic Enlightenment thinker, and then you have the rationalist versus the empiricist, you see the socialist, communist against the capitalist. These are all within the framework of humanism and secularism. You would need a meta critique that could solve the issue, and it will not come from the depths of Western thought, certainly, because if the basis is secular, they will not be able to counter that ideas. It would be one proposal after another proposal in that sense. Hey, Omar.
So I was trying to say, it's like basically everything we're talking about goes back to Adam. So there's the same way goods, and there's can separate from suluk and da'wah and suluk, and it's just like when we think about this, is the only problem is our nafs. Basically, it goes back to our nafs and shaitan. It's like so scary.
Yes.
Before we even go to others, we have to go back to ourselves and really fix ourselves before we can actually look after the alim. Because I've personally seen alim ulama who really doesn't have this suluk. You can just say anyone's fasik, this alim is a fasik, just because they're not in the same manhaj. So, like Mambuti, I think so now, this book, هكذا وعلى الإسلام. This is the way we're supposed to da'wah. Is not bring an umbrella and put people in. You're just supposed to give yourself da'wah, and the umbrella will just come by itself, and the community will come from that. Not we try to pull people in into something.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, so that's why the problem of corruption of knowledge leads to the loss of adab, and the loss of adab is the ground of the rise of false leaders. So how can we, as you have pointed out, I mean, all the various ulama who are on the right, on the manhaj, will point to the same solution. Yes, they may have different terms, they may have different uslub, but they will arrive at the same conclusion, that we must revitalize adab as right action.
How consistent has that track been in terms of answering these questions of adab and in the Islamic tradition? They've been consistent and congruent. We see it from across all scholars and across all lands of Islamic centers. The
inseparability between ilm and adab is something that is a feature of Islamic civilization throughout. I think that cannot be denied. I mean, from the earliest periods of the start of documentation from the ahadith, we will see that all the great ulama across both the Sunni and the Shi'i, even the Mu'tazili traditions, they all speak about adab, isn't it? And that's amazing. The fact that the attestation of the Quranic origins of the concept of adab. Some Orientalists, the likes of Franz Rosenthal, they, perhaps they are clouded by their own, judgment. They will say that certain concepts are extra Quranic if you cannot find the word in the Quran. Like the word ma'rifah, as a coinage, it's not found in the Quran. Do you have that? Its other forms are possible, arifah and so on, but ma'rifah as the other of ilm. So therefore, they say that it's something that the Muslims develop independently. Rosenthal went as far as saying that in the Prophet Muhammad's time, because he took the conclusion that Muhammad was the writer of the Quran. So therefore, he said that the Prophet Muhammad wasn't did not try to introduce some abstract notions. He was a practical man, and that his argument was that using statistical analysis of the words, interesting, he came to the arrival of some interesting conclusions. One is that there's 78,000 words in the Quran. I didn't remember counting. And the fact is that after Allah and Rabb, the word that is most statistically significant is ilm. There are other words like the unavoidable words such as qala and kana and its various forms, but these are not concepts. They don't. Qala is not a concept. It's something to it. So after Allah and Rabb, the word that is most statistically significant is ilm. Yes. But his conclusion is that, well, since these, so knowledge is therefore important, but other words which do not recur and not repeated, this must not be important. Like the word adal. Yes, it doesn't occur in many places in the Quran. So therefore, the Prophet didn't talk about justice. Or the word shura, yes, it only occurs in 2 places. Therefore, but we don't take that conclusion. Rather, we say that because words such as justice, that is a human fitrah, and the state. I mean, even the Jahili Arabs, as corrupt as they were, they still understood the importance of justice. What is needed is ilm to ground justice. Just as in modern times, one person once came to see Professor Atas and was looking at his books, and she said, where is the word peace in your writings? Peace is the most important concept. Why don't you talk about peace? Yeah, but if you think properly, not every word, yes, that is important has to be repeated. Not every word that is important has to be repeated. Sometimes the word that you consider important is the consequence of something. Like so likewise the word adab, therefore. Do you find it in the Quran? No, but the Prophet did use the word adab. And then, but that is because it is assumed that if you have ilm, you have to have adab. In the Quranic semantic structure, knowledge is inseparable from adab. So therefore, it wouldn't be even, unless the Muslim community came to lose it. Yes, then of course the word would so in the same way as if you imagine the condition of the Jahili Arabs. Yes, what they needed the most was ilm. Yes, because their condition was jahil. Yes, but once it's restored, the semantic content of what is discussed in the Quran would place things in their proper places. So adab is right action, and right action stems from knowledge. And throughout history, we will see that adab is something that is very much emphasized and inseparable from it.
Even other manhaj, even though they don't follow much, they don't say ilm, da'wah and suluk, they say ilm, amal and da'wah. So actually when you're making amal on your ilm, actually adab and suluk comes there in your amal.
Yes.
So just different.
What I was seeing was that I wonder whether we could strongly say that Islam's tradition is the only one that's been consistent with how it understands. As opposed to, say, for example, if you're Greek, in one era they say it's this, another era they say it's that. And if you're Western, one day you follow the Greek method, one day you follow another method, one day you follow another method. So there seems to be confusion there, or at least a constant shift of positions. Whereas for the Muslim, you can say, look, what they say 1,000 years ago is no different than what they say 500 years ago. So there's a sense of consistency there.
Actually, even in the Quran, it doesn't talks anything about adab, but it says about tazkiyah.
Yeah.
So I don't think so. You can have tazkiyah without adab. The only way your tazkiyah is complete is with adab.
Yeah. And then I think the word hikmah is also inseparable from adab, because as you find in the collection of verses in Surah Al-Isra and then in Surah Luqman, hikmah is mentioned as a property of a man of adab. Isn't it? First, that he doesn't commit shirk, and then the notion of tawheed is connected with filial piety. That's amazing. You see, within one verse, وَقَضَى رَبُّكَ أَلَّا تَعْبُدُوا إِلَّا إِيَّاهُ وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. So the notion that you should not worship Allah, you should not worship any other deities other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is connected with being kind to one's parents. So therefore there is reciprocity. There is the understanding of tarbiyah. There is the understanding of shukr. Shukr is one opposite of kufr is shukr, and the other opposite is iman. So here you will see that it's connected, because you receive kindness from your parents and you receive kindness from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The sole exception, of course, aside from the fact of the irreversible distance of the levels of kindness you receive from Allah and from your parents, is the fact that your parents will might grow to old age and might grow to weakness. So then the right adab is then commanded in that instance, and various other verses.
Even, I don't know, you were talking about one of the Orientalists, says that the Prophet didn't bring anything about adab. But most of his hadith, he says, even like when he says about sab'ul mubiqat, billah, huququl walidain, wa wa'bul madad, as-saraqa. So that's all transgression. So that's against adab.
Yeah. And then, of course, this is the failure method sometimes, because if you're reduced to method like statistics in that sense, if it's not numerous, it's not important. Well, sometimes all you needed to say is all you need is one verse. Inna Allah ya'murukum bil adl. That would be sufficient. The form of the command is already evident for us that it's important. Inshallah. Wallahu a'lam. So for those online, I think that's at the end of our meeting today. Until we meet again, inshallah, next week or the week after. Wassalamu alaikum.